What up, everyone? So this Thursday, for many throughout the U.S., it's totally a day of celebration, right? You got the turkeys, the cowboys, the football, family, food comas, and all that gratefulness. But for another population, today is actually a day of mourning. The story a lot of us heard growing up about Thanksgiving is that this is the day that the natives and pilgrims gathered together to share in a bountiful harvest. One where indigenous folks stepped into the cut and shared some of their farming practices with these starving, humble Europeans. This all leading to a beautiful understanding of how these different cultures could coexist. Sure, there'd be wars and misunderstandings and even lives lost along the way, but this was that benchmark celebration showing that these two different groups could come together in a shared understanding. And out of it, in this almost unspoken way, the indigenous groups agreed to quietly disappear into the background and hand off the land and its future to these new, supposed Americans. Okay, for these that mourn this day, this is the farthest thing from the truth. It's complete and utter bullshit. In fact, thousands gathered in Plymouth, Massachusetts to vehemently challenge this myth. They gathered together to share in what actually happened back in the 16th and 17th centuries. Histories about how these new settlers brought guns, disease, and an intentional, terrifying violence to this land and started systematically murdering men, women, and children. And how over centuries of killing people and culture, this new country called the United States intentionally built a myth to cover up those sins. You guessed it, that myth is Thanksgiving. A celebration that drowns out all that history of murder, land extraction, and forced cultural extinction. I was lucky a few years ago to speak with some of these people who lead what's come to be known as the National Day of Mourning. I got to hear firsthand and document the centuries of struggle indigenous individuals have waged against these false narratives. How they fought against an oppressive national culture of violence, but also indifference. And surprisingly, how they've won. At times it's a sad story, but it's also incredibly inspiring. And honestly, it's one that's kind of changed me forever. You can check it out in the Spotify app. Search for the podcast Not Past It. In that feed, scroll and tap the episode called Sabotaging Thanksgiving. We'll also list the link in our show notes. Now today on Masculinity, we wanted to share an old episode of ours that documents other forms of indigenous resistance. Sure, yes, in the past, but also present stories of how indigenous people across this continent are still fighting against injustice. And maybe surprisingly or not, many of them are led by women. Keestin Odell from the Frog Lake First Nations joins us in the episode to help better understand the importance of these voices, and also shares with us his own family's history of resistance over the decades. In the end, all that Keestin shares helps me recalibrate my thinking about some of these myths, like what it can really mean to be a man, and how to really be a warrior. Look, I get it. Life is not easy right now, and wanting a day to just relax and forget all the shit that's going on is totally fair. But we do hope you can find it in yourself to make space for these important, honest stories. Because if we don't, we're choosing to believe a lie that allows those who have been betrayed by that lie to continue to suffer. And I don't know if that's something I can choose for myself to be grateful for today. Okay, without further ado, here is that previous episode of ours, Hearing the Warriors. It's your boy, Remoy George Phillip the First.
And this is Samantha and Zessie.
This is Masculinity.
The show that investigates the performance of masculinity in the world today. Today's Tuesday, Remoy.
And?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, our episodes come out on Thursdays usually.
Well, Thursday is a day for a lot of folks here in America who will be stuffing their faces But I think dropping a few days earlier could be a good listening appetizer.
All right. Is this another one of your Remoy punnyisms that I don't usually get?
Well, it could be, but I think we have a friend here to help us listen. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. My name's Keestin Odell.
Keestin, okay, so you work in the university collegiate system, correct? Yeah?
Correct. Yeah, I work in indigenous offices within post-secondaries. Yeah.
Okay, well then, pop quiz, Keestin. What are we talking about on the show today?
Today, we're going to talk about a little bit about indigenous resistance, how that led to some formations of identity of indigenous masculinity, and really how looking into our own traditions, our own language can change the way we think and view and perform our own masculinity.
Wow, Keestin's the best that's ever done that in this show's history.
Thank God you're here, Keestin.
Yeah.
I know.
Up next, we get to listen to all that Keestin just told about because he nailed it. That's coming up after the break.
Curious about next-gen men? We're a small part of a much larger movement to undefine masculinity for a brighter future. Our mission is clear: empower the next generation to use their curiosity, empathy, and courage to build a more equitable world. Join the Next Gen Men community as we learn and unlearn together. We're here to support boys and men to break free from limiting stereotypes. We're not just an organization, we're a catalyst for reimagining masculinity and fostering inclusivity. We're here to help open up possibilities for what men and boys can be. Explore the world of Next Gen Men at nextgenmen.ca and join the community to make a difference. Next Gen Men, shaping tomorrow's leaders one step at a time. Join us and help undefine masculinity and empower the next generation of men to lead with empathy and courage.
Welcome back. You know what, Samantha?
Yes, Remoy?
I think it's time Remoy George Philip I, take back the narrative.
Oh, what? No way. I can't believe a man wants to take and talk. I couldn't imagine that could happen. What?
Well, look, I'm just really interested in what we're talking about today. Is that okay?
You know what? I think that is great, actually.
I can't tell if I'm getting some sarcasm here. I don't know what landmines I'm stepping into.
No, I think it actually really serves us for you to take the reign when it's right for you to do so. That's really what gender equity should look like.
Yeah, okay. Tell me more, please.
Well, I mean, it's like men can and actually should lead because all people can lead. Not because we're made to believe that men are the only ones who are born to lead or anyone else is like not entitled to lead. You lead when it's your time to lead, and I lead when it's my time to lead. Capiche?
Actually, that kind of makes a lot of sense. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Hey, we're working here together. And honestly, I can't wait to hear what stories you got in store for me. Take it away, Remoy.
Well, I'm glad to say we won't be doing it alone.
No, we won't. Thank God.
Today, we got Keestin Odell here from the Frog Lake First Nations in what is now Alberta, Canada. He's here to help us talk us through some of these stories. Keestin, thank you for being here, and please do introduce yourself.
I'm so happy to be on the podcast and for inviting me. So, Danse Kisodel Netsigasan, Otunia Aik Sagaihagan. So, my name's Keestin Odell. I am originally from Frog Lake First Nation, which is a Cree nation here in central northern Alberta. Right now, talking to you from Calgary. So, thanks so much for having me today here.
Oh, it's going to be fun. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about some stories. I'm going to enlighten Samantha, and Keestin, you're going to help me out. All right, you ready?
Let's do this. I'm excited.
Okay, so Samantha, let's go. I'm going to transport us back in time. You ready?
I'm ready.
It's safe to say, right, first off, you were a 90s kid, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
And you grew up in like the Bay Area, correct?
I did, starting in 1996. Before that, I was in the Francais land.
Well, actually, that's actually kind of great because like 96 is when like what I will say in the canon of American movies comes out. When I say the movie The Rock, what does that bring to mind, Samantha?
So the first thing that comes to mind is like this movie poster that kind of looked like it was fire. You know, and like all their faces. I know that James Bond was in it, Sean Connery.
The Rock's a tourist attraction.
Not the real James Bond, in my opinion, but I digress.
Well,
and yeah.
Well, yeah, okay. You're getting onto the island here because this movie takes place on Alcatraz, the infamous abandoned prison on a remote island in San Francisco Bay. And the movie's about this like group of U.S. military rogue folks who like take over the rock, right? Because the U.S. military is stockpiling these weapons there, and this group's hoping to steal and sell it on the black market. It's a total like 90s action classic. Michael Bay, Nicolas Cage, like you said, Sean Connery.
Summer. Get ready to rock.
That sounds about right. Like, that's totally, it's all coming back. Yep.
So the movie came out in 1996. Do you happen to know about a real-life Alcatraz takeover that happened almost 3 decades earlier?
Honestly, I can't say I do. No.
You shouldn't feel in the lurch because like a lot of people really don't know about this. I'm wondering, Keestin, you're up in Canada. Wondering, do you happen to know about this a little bit?
I think I remember just a snippet of occupation of Alcatraz back in the day. So I know there's some slogans or iconography that surround Alcatraz and indigenous peoples, but to be honest, I wouldn't say I know the full story.
So what happened is in 1969, 89 indigenous women and men launched off in 3 boats from the mainland across the bay. They landed on the rock in the Cloak of Dawn. Some even had to like jump ship to swim the final leg of the trip. The people spread out through the abandoned prison buildings on the island, on the lawns. They painted on the water tower, home of the free Indian land. And this wasn't the first attempt, but this was the primary attempt because earlier in the 60s, the U.S. government had signed a law called the Indian Termination Act. And yes, it was called that. And yes, it basically means what it says. Not to mention the decades of residential schools separating Native children away from their parents, forcing them to learn English, divorcing them from traditions. Then there are the centuries of broken treaties that kept taking land from the indigenous people and the people of the First Nations. And it's really, again, important to remember these treaties are in English. That's going to be a theme we keep talking about here. This is a language that would have been very foreign to most of the peoples that were involved, specifically the indigenous. And I think, Samantha, this is cool because you speak multiple languages. You come from an immigrant family. You've worked in translation. Kind of, have you ever thought about this relationship before? Like, what that means for a government of settlers to create agreements with like people in a language that is completely foreign to them?
Actually, my family's Cameroonian. And so, the official language in Cameroon is not like Bafang or Batier, which is the languages that my parents speak, but it's French, right? And at one point it was English when they were like fighting over who was going to like colonize more. So, for me, it really speaks to the way that people are disenfranchised in their own country by using institutions to marginalize them through language, essentially. It's like completely disconnects you from your world and what you can be and what you can do through language.
And Keestin, I assume like that this kind of use of language and quote unquote treaties, again, is something that has affected kind of the family and areas that you come from.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of our negotiations when it came to treaties were done through English language or used as used through a local translator. And so the nuances were used to the advantage of settler colonialism and not to the advantage of us, sort of thing, a lot of times in those interpretations or translations when it comes to treaty.
Just a few years ago, there was a recent scientific study that came out that kind of documents that in the initial years of European occupation in the Americas, like roughly 55 million indigenous persons died. That genocide is like, it actually created a small ice age. And so getting back to Alcatraz, it's safe to assume this tiny little occupation was warranted and powerful. The group quickly named their organization Indians of All Tribes. Using their skills and the support of donors on the mainland, they were able to bring water and electricity back onto the island. They occupied the land for almost a year and a half, like 18, 19 months. Nixon and the FBI tried to fight them at times. The president's men cut the electricity phone lines, etc., but the IAT did not back down. They made even more boat trips to acquire generators, water, and more. All this got the media's attention, and I actually want to play you a little clip.
As the younger warriors, wrapped in sleeping bags, slept, the community breakfast was being prepared at the campfire. Cleaning up after took a special meaning. They didn't want it to look like a white man's island. The dawn brought to light and camera other additional changes in the landscape, and newsmen were invited.
We do not fear your threat to charge us with crimes on our land. we and all other oppressed people would welcome the spectacle of proof before the world of your title by genocide. Nevertheless, we seek peace.
How long do you feel you can stay here?
A man once said, till hell freezes over.
Okay, so thoughts?
It's funny if you think about that video from a few decades ago, is that that same audio could be used decades before or decades afterwards, of that continuation of indigenous resistance through community and through talking about land rights and about coming together and really forcing people to take an eye view or a focus on indigenous issues. I think occupation, coming together as a community and creating community where it was originally taken away from, is some of the hallmarks of sort of indigenous resistance from all the way into the 1800s until right into Alcatraz, all the way to Standing Rock. It's a continuation of the way that we protest, the way that we come together, and the way of really forcing people to understand that we are still here and that this is indigenous land, and reminding people about the narrative of whose land it is, how that land got there, who occupies that land, and who benefits from that land.
Well, I think the main thing, like through this fight, are showing that they're not accepting the common narrative. It doesn't matter how, prevalent it is. So this was like a really, really powerful moment to share. But what exactly does this have to do with masculinity with a hard K?
Smart question, fair question to bring us back to this podcast, right? Well, this particular protest was led by Richard Oakes, who was the one who we just heard at the end of that clip, and Lenata Warjack, who's actually known as Professor Warjack, which I think is pretty badass. It's actually super rare in the 60s to have a movement led by a Native woman and a Native man. She has become symbolic for indigenous feminism. Both like her and Richard made the deliberate choice to bring their families with them over to Alcatraz. Like they were trying to make this a goal of protect the next generation, protect our families. And that actually takes us to story number 2. We've already started talking about the importance of language. And again, how it's so normal to speak English in the Americas, or maybe French even. But if we think on it, those languages were what were used to disenfranchise people. So I want to play our next video. This is from TikTok from the user Shinanova. Let's see if this works. Okay, so that's a video that you folks saw. It's going to sound different for people in their ears. Can you two describe to the audience what you saw? There were actually captions kind of for this video as well. What were the captions saying along with that?
Yeah, I saw some Inuit throat singing. I know there's a variety of different reasons, games, traditions that go along with the throat singing. Really cool to see, really cool to watch in person. In the captions there, it was saying that they were doing the throat singing, and it talked a little bit about residential schools and that we don't fully know what's happened in those residential schools and this loss of culture and language and traditions in there.
Yeah, it's exactly this video is from Sheena Novalinga. She and her mother are from the Inuit First Nations. In this video, they were throat singing together. And yeah, it's a tradition that's actually passed down from mothers to daughters, which is pretty cool, especially seeing it in this video like this. That was her and her mom. Inuit throat singing was banned by Christian missionaries in the early 20th century who saw it as satanic. It said 4 women in the Pervernituk community in northern Quebec remained skilled in this kind of practice, and these elders passed the ritual to the younger generations to keep this tradition alive. I'm wondering, Keestin, is there any sort of language tradition where you come from?
Yeah, I'm from the Cree Nation. So Crees, we span from all the way into Quebec and Labrador up into the Northwest Territories a bit and into Alberta here. So we're quite a lot of us. One of the traditions of how we call ourselves Cree is actually the name that they gave us. So the French called us Le Crees. When they saw us, we do this great Sagway, it's called, that war cry. And when they saw us, they said, Le Crees, the criers. But even our own language, we call ourselves the Nehiao people. And Nehiao means a four-bodied person. So if you ever look at a medicine wheel, if you Google medicine wheel, you'll see this wheel and it has 4 colors in it. Tons of teachings. You can spend forever talking about it. But in this case, it means the emotional, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, all within there. And so to become a Nehiao person, you have to be balanced in all those 4 parts. So call ourselves Cree, that means kind of what, right? To Cree. But if I were to refer to myself as a Nehiao person, that in itself would carry on traditions, ideas, remind me of my culture, of the teachings of our grandparents, of our elders, and would change it on. So there's more and more of people referring to ourselves and making sure we're referring to ourselves as Nehiao people to carry on that tradition that's even just within that word.
Yeah, I also think, like, Samantha, like back in our first episode back this season with Herman, like when we were laughing about like girl math, and you also said something really poignant, like how it's men need to listen to women. It's like a way of showing humanity, right? I kind of feel that tracks here too. Like, why the fuck aren't we listening? We need to listen.
I really like that as well. That's listening to people. I like to, when I talk about the history or in colonization with other people in Canada, they all have an idea of what is. And it was Stephen Hawking who said the greatest threat to knowledge is not non-knowledge, but it's the illusion of knowledge. And I think that's what a lot of people may have when it comes to the experiences of people of color, the history of colonization, of the genocide of indigenous peoples. Everybody has an illusion of knowledge of that was taught by their great-grandparents, by their parents, by their grandparents, that has always benefited. So that illusion of knowledge it's almost like a safety blanket sometimes, right? Being confronted with all you know is wrong. And now it's time to shut up and listen can be pretty shocking sometimes. But I come in and said, it's an illusion of knowledge that you're holding on to, right? Even when it comes to masculinities of what the man should be, it's up to us to shed that illusion.
100%.
That illusion of knowledge and that illusion of masculinity. Keestin's going to tell us more, and also about the advocacy coming from his community that's connected to a different masculinity. Stay tuned.
I actually found out later by a friend that Matthew tried to kill himself after that.
What does it look like to go from a perpetrator of violence to an undaunted ally for those who are vulnerable?
So, I mean, that made me feel really guilty, and I couldn't eat anything, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything. I mean, I thought I deserved what he got. And that's when I started talking to you.
This is the story of Lewis, a 12-year-old who went through a remarkable transformation to become the young man he is today. It's also one of the most powerful things I've ever recorded as part of Breaking the Boy Code, a podcast centered on the inner lives of boys and what it looks like for parents and educators to raise the next generation of men. Created in collaboration with Next Gen Men Podcast Network, listen to Breaking the Boy Code podcast wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm here with Keestin Odell, who's from the Frog Lake First Nations, and Samantha. I think we're going to have a 3-way conversation.
Well, actually, I'm going to go ahead and bow out on this one. I feel like you're really the one for this, Remoy. I don't say this often, so please just go ahead and ride that wave.
I'm going to take that wave. Ooh.
I'm gonna let you guys do this one. But hey, it's been awesome.
See you later, Samantha. And now we'll jump into it. Okay, so Keestin, we've been talking about Indigenous response and resilience. There's a big event that happens in 1885, correct?
Yeah. So Frog Lake is really Canada and our Indigenous history there was a signing of all our numbered treaties in the mid to late 1800s. In 1876, we signed the treaty and we're supposed to get treaty rights, rations. The buffalo were disappearing. We're supposed to get the right to education. A variety of things were supposed to happen by 1885. A lot of those promises weren't met. Cases of sexual assault happening in our community from some of the farm agents. There's lots of examples of how our Indian agent, his name was Thomas Quinn, was really violent and terrible to the indigenous peoples. A lot of the people were starving, so he invited them over to his house and said, we're going to slaughter an ox. Everybody's invited. So all the band members came up and he opened the door. He said, April Fools, get out of here. And everybody went home hungry.
Wow.
There was another time in which they slaughtered another ox and they threw the guts, so the heart, the liver, the intestines, out their back door. And some of the indigenous grandmothers, cookums, we call them, went to go grab those intestines, took them home. And then the Indian agent came, grabbed them back, buried them in the dirt, and then said, you don't even deserve this. And then there's actually one report where the Indian agent sent a letter to the Canadian government and said that the Indians over in Frog Lake are going to rebel because they're starving. And the response from the Canadian government was cut their rations in half. And so there was that Northwest resistance was happening over a little east of Alberta, of Frog Lake, and there was talks of victory there, and it inspired some of those Cree warriors and the war chief, Wandering Spirit. They were inspired to kind of lead a resistance against the government. And then on April 2nd, 1885, it was called the Frog Lake Massacre, in which 9 settlers were killed in our community. And that led to a lot of charges, and it led to the largest mass execution in Canadian history, which actually happened here in Alberta after that Northwest resistance. And then afterwards, it was actually considered a mistrial for what happened during that Frog Lake Massacre and what happened in the Northwest resistance, and that none of the indigenous people a part of it were tried fairly, of course, because it was all done in English as well. And then growing up, it was something that was a bit shameful.
Can you talk more about that shame, that initial response, or the growing shame that's kind of lingered for a while?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So 1885, this happened, and then they removed a bunch of the indigenous peoples from our reserve to a different area, and Frog Lake almost became nothing if it wasn't for a few people who decided to stay. They said Wandering Spirit, who was the war chief who shot the first shot and killed Thomas Quinn, that his hair went white by the end. And he actually tried to harm himself near the end because of that shame that came with him. But of course, that narrative came from people who taught our grandparents, who taught our great-grandparents in these residential schools. And so they're the ones who got to teach the narrative to us. So they told us this was shameful. This is something bad you did. So even into my mom's generation, they would shame people. I went to an off-res school when I was in grade 12, and I told one of the kids I was from Frog Lake, and he said, oh, wasn't there a bunch of people wasn't there like a big murder there? And I said, are you talking about the Frog Lake Massacre? Yeah, that's the one. I said, of 1885? And he said, no, bro, this just happened. Like my mom told me, like it happened a few years ago. An illusion of knowledge, right? And so 1885 to modern day, there's still a prejudice or a talk that happens, again, because of the narrative that's been told by other people.
Okay, so help me understand this. So there's, you have like initial resistance to occupation that gets kind of re-narrativized and re-understood. What was the resilience to better understand this or bring the true history to life?
I think it was once Indigenous people starting to have a voice to talk about it and giving those opportunities. A really good example, there's about an hour north of Frog Lake, there's a residential school called Blue Quills. And it was a residential school that my grandfather went to, that tons and tons of people attended that residential school. In 1969, they ended the agreement of residential schools with the Catholic Church. And so some of the schools were being shut down. The local reserves got together and decided we want to run this school. We want to take it away from the government, away from the church, and turn it into a school for First Nations kids that will teach us our language, that'll teach us our culture, that'll teach us our traditions, and that will be fully First Nations run. And The county, the St. Paul County, is super against it. They did not want it to happen. The government was against it. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was against it. Everybody was against it. And it was called Indian Control of Indian Education. And so they fought over and over again to have that school.
Yeah, real quick, this may be a stupid question, but why were they against it?
I think there is just fear in letting Indigenous peoples run things or have some sort of power. The other one is that they wanted to turn that residential school into a boarding school for rural, non-Indigenous kids. And so they ended up protesting. It was called Indian Control of Indian Education in the 1970s, went back and forth, and then finally, one day they said, let the Indians have it. We'll have it back in 6 months. And it's been 53 years now that it's been running as the first ever university in Canada, First Nations University in Canada.
Oh, wow.
It's actually where my mom, my aunties got their Bachelor of Education, where they got their Masters of Education, and they continue working in our communities. So today, within those generations, because where people had control over their education, over their own narratives, over their own history and the ways that they can teach it, that we're finding strength from our stories and our old stories and our community stories.
I'm wondering, like, with this legacy of like taking it back and resilience and bringing your history to the fore, like, are there even like any post-colonial legacies that you've had to fight and your community has to be resilient against within your communities? Even going back to the word shame of like this post-colonial effect. And like, I'm wondering if you've thought about how that informs masculinity through the generation.
Yeah. I mean, we look at our Indigenous traditions. Well, okay, to be a man, to have my rite of passage, I need to be a part of this ceremony. I need to learn how to speak in this way. I need to be able to identify, perform, react, and think about these ways, and all of those being taken away. And so you don't have the ability to join a society. Many different Indigenous communities had societies and men's societies where young boys would come up and learn how to become men through witnessing, watching, and being with other men. Well, you take away that. What ways are they supposed to show themselves as men? You try to use the colonial way, and it's not going to work for you either, because they're never going to let you get to that standard, right? Even joining war, if Indigenous men became educated, they became doctors, if they joined the army, if they became RCMP, you became enfranchised, you lost your Indian status and you're kicked off the reserve, right? So if you go into these professions that are masculine, or go into these professions that are seemed acceptable by settler society, then you can't be a part of your community. So it's kind of, what do you reject and what do you accept, and to see yourselves as a man, right?
What are the effects you think that's had on communities, specifically the men in those communities over decades, centuries even?
Oh man, yeah. The effects it's had on Indigenous men or masculinity. I guess it gets harder to define what masculinity is, right? I think of my dad growing up in the East Coast. He grew up by the ocean with lots of other men. And I think there is lots of ways for him to be recognized and seen as a man, or a man, in training for when he's in his adolescence, being hardworking, tough. And he's accepted by not only people within his community, but accepted by people outside of his community, in towns, when he went to the military, stuff like that. He was always seen as a man who can achieve those things. But when you're an Indigenous man, say growing up in an Indigenous community, and you don't have the ability to practice your culture, learn your culture, how are you proving to other Indigenous men, specifically elders or people in the community who put emphasis on those traditions, those culture and that language, but you can't reach that because you don't have access to it. So perhaps you reject it and you say, well, oil fields are a big place in my community. So you join the oil fields and you get the lifted truck and you make money, you buy the nice house, all that kind of stuff like that. But you're still rejected by the non-Indigenous group because you're still Indigenous, sort of thing. And so it's kind of a catch-22. What am I going to use to solidify my identity as a man, and a successful man, and a man that's worth, when I don't know which area will accept me and I don't know which area has more value, I suppose, right?
I've heard you like kind of redefining like this term warrior in this kind of conversation. How does that fit in? What does that mean?
Yeah, I love the resurgence of Indigenous language, and I love learning about the nuances in it and the teachings that go with it. Growing up as a Cree person, as Indigenous person, we always hear it all the time: be a warrior, one day you're going to become a warrior. It's who you are. Be ready for it. Our community needs warriors. And then really thinking about that warrior concept. When I think of warrior, Brad Pitt, Jon Snow, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, all those things kind of come to mind, right? It's really the Western warrior who's probably really muscular, who has a shield, who fights other guys. And so when I was finding out what Cree it was in Cree, it's the word Ogisatao. And Ogisatao in Cree means a provider or provider of the people, right? So to be a provider, it's gender neutral, first of all. So anybody could be that provider. And if I think of myself as a warrior, they say, Keestin, be a warrior. But if I was in my community, they said, Keestin, be a provider. It's always being responsive. And so in our Cree ways, in our indigenous ways, it's understanding how to be a provider for people and provide what they're needing. So a warrior needs to be strong, sure. But to be a provider is to be responsive to what that community needs are. Say back in the day, that 1885 Northwest Resistance, maybe we needed our men to be warriors. We needed them to be Ogisatao who responded to threats to our community, who responded to injustices, who responded to violence against us. And then nowadays, with mental health, with depression, addictions, there's a different kind of providing we need to do for our communities now. Perhaps warriors need to step up and we need to provide compassion and provide kindness and empathy for others. When we have our ceremonies and you're an Oskapios, it's what I do. It's you help out in that ceremony and you feed yourself last. So say there's a feast, I'd go around and I'd serve everyone and I would eat last. And this is the same thing that our hunters would do. They would go out and they would get their game and they'd come back and they'd have to feed everybody first and then eat last. And so to become an Ogisatao is to become balanced enough that I can provide whatever that community needs. Does the community needs me to be physical, my body to be present, to use my strength? Does the community need my spirituality of understanding, of guidance? Does my community need my emotions of compassion, of empathy for others? And so working on becoming that nehiao, that balanced person, so I can become an Ogisatao and be responsive in whatever needs that community needs.
Humor my language dumbassery, but like,
yeah.
Ogisatao, is that how I pronounce it?
Perfect. Yeah, Ogisatao. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, do you think that there's space within to be an Ogisatao to be vulnerable and say, I need help? Can a warrior be a person who asks for help?
Oh, totally. I think that's one of the beautiful things about a lot of our Cree traditions or traditions around there. We have one ceremony called a sweat lodge, but in Cree, it's actually pronounced as the crying lodge. So it's the place that people can go into. It's one of our ceremonies. Men and women can join in the Cree ceremony. We're there, we pray, we sing our songs, and it has the opportunity for people to give thanks, and it also has the opportunity for people to ask for strength. And so when I go into there, I've been going into these crying lodges, these sweat lodges since I was a kid. And what was the most beautiful thing was seeing my father, my grandfather, my grandfather's brothers, my uncles, my cousins, all these men cry quite often, right? Yeah, they would come in there and they would speak quite openly from their hearts because it's a place of ceremony and it's a place of vulnerability for them. And so it was never an odd thing to see my grandfather, my Mushroom, he was the chief of our community for a long time. And to see a man like that be vulnerable and open and share the things that he's thankful for and cry about the things that he can't change it's a beautiful thing to see. And then even me growing up, I was going since I was, my mom said I was in diapers, but when I was around the age of 8 or so, they started asking me to speak. And so you would speak before you would have the next part of the ceremony, the part of the rounds. Not only did I get to speak, but I had other men, other warriors, other Ogisatao who would listen to me. And so having the opportunity of being a kid and going, well, I'm really thankful that I got a new bike this week, but to have other grown men who I respected to turn to me and say, that's a beautiful thing to be thankful for. Thank you for sharing, Keestin. It creates a lot of pride in yourself, right? And that opportunity to be heard by other men that isn't just yelling, right? And that's how you become a balanced person. Is how else can you become a fully fleshed out emotional person if you can't cry?
Damn. I really did actually learn a whole lot this episode.
Me too. I mean, that end was so powerful. Like there's like a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's especially prescient coming this week of, the day of giving thanks.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll be heading up to the National Day of Mourning up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Those who don't know, it's like a demonstration where it's actually led by Indigenous women of multi-generations leading it at the moment, and who use their voices, and other Indigenous voices from around the world join them to tell the Thanksgiving narrative from the Wampanoag experience. That's those who interacted with the pilgrims at that time.
Wow, that's what's up.
Yeah, and it's very powerful. Indigenous voices speak throughout the day. Us non-natives shut the F up, and we just get to listen. Also, many people there fast for half the day, if not the entire day. It's a way to show that we're ready to sacrifice and listen.
That's really beautiful. But I mean, what if you can't make it to Plymouth like me on short notice? What can I do to support? And with like my leg. I'm in a boot, so I actually can't go.
Good questions. Yeah, there'll be like a live stream of the day's events on YouTube. We'll throw the links up in our show notes and on socials. You may also want to consider fasting, maybe like not all day, maybe just a tiny bit. It actually could be an opportunity to share with those around you how important it is to make the effort to listen and hear Native voices.
We'll actually throw up more of this information on our website, so you can find it at masculinitypod.com. And we'll also be sharing links over on the socials at masculinitypod. Of course, always spelled with a K. And there's a lot to listen to here, so I hope you guys tune in.
Yeah, let's make this promise to keep listening. We'll catch back up next time. Until then,
I'm Samantha and Zessie.
To boy Remoy George Phillips, the first.
Thank you so much for listening.
Peace.
Ciao.
Samantha's going to make fun of me.